Well, well done for extracting yourself from the craziness of the SOAS elections, and welcome to this talk co-hosted by Stop the War and Counterfire. I'm Sam Darthy, I'm a student at SOAS, and I'm a national officer of the Stop the War Coalition. I'm very, very pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Lindsey German. Lindsey is an activist of unparalleled experience. She co-founded the Stop the War Coalition back in October 2001. And I don't think she or anyone predicted that the Stop the War Coalition would still be going on in 2013, but it is, because the wars still keep coming, sadly. And Lindsey was one of the main organisers for the biggest protest in British history, which was the 2 million man march on 15th of February 2003 against the Iraq War. And she's going to introduce a talk about her new book, How a Century of War Changed the Lives of Women, which, as the name suggests, is a book about how British women have been affected by war. So without further ado, can you please give a warm welcome to Lindsey German.
I'm just wondering what the best way is to do this. Should I go to the podium, or should I just stand here, or should I sit in my armchair and what do people want to kind of move maybe a little bit into it, so it's a bit sort of, I don't know, intimate or cosy, or whatever we want to call it.
People don't like sitting in the front.
I know, but they can sit
Alright,
at
that's
the
the second row
back,
back.
closer in. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think what I'll do is actually sit down, because I want to really explain why I wrote the book and what I think the importance of it is in terms of the various arguments. And the book itself has got two, I would say, sort of separate components to it, really. One is the whole question of how war has changed women's lives. And this is about Britain. It's not a story of the whole of the world. It's about particularly the impact of war and the 2 world wars on Britain is one of the things I wanted to look at, and I see that very much as one of the things that then led to all sorts of changes in the post-war world to do with women's position at work, women's position in education, and all those other sorts of things. So that's one of the bits of the book I wanted to talk about. The other one I wanted to talk about was the quite remarkable involvement of women in the anti-war movement and in peace movements in modern times. I don't know if people saw an article by Seamus Milne today in The Guardian where he talks about, and in fact I was talking to him about this question, that women now are more left-wing on most issues, and this has long been the case on questions of war and peace, where women are quite considerably more to the left in terms of attitude surveys and so on than men are. But this is also now true about a whole range of issues, about a whole range of social issues and political issues and so on. This is a very, very big change indeed from 100 years ago, which is the period when I first started about talking about the position of women, and therefore I want to try and explain some of those things. So that's what I'm going to have a go at doing tonight, obviously in a very brief way, and I want to explain this by starting with the changes in women's life. And I suppose I should say something about my own life, because my mother and father were that generation who were involved in the Second World War, and I was brought up in a household where everybody had been involved in the war and everybody talked about the war, and it was the most exciting thing that happened to most of them ever in their lives. So this was very, very common to me, and particularly with my mother. She was a teenager in London during the war, and therefore she experienced bombing and doodle bugs and things like that. But she also had a very outward-going life in terms of social life, in terms of buying clothes, in terms of things that you don't normally associate with war. And therefore I wanted to put those two sort of sides of it together. And the fact that women's lives have been very much changed by the question of war, I think, is absolutely incontrovertible. I don't know if anybody here watches Downton Abbey or Upstairs, Downstairs. Anybody watch these things at all? Yeah, people don't like admitting to it, but it's kind of, you kind of watch it in horror at how I do anyway, and how bad it was. But of course, that period before 1914, the majority of women who worked in this country outside of the home worked in domestic service. They worked in the downstairs of the big houses, and sometimes small houses, sometimes houses of professional middle class people. They were the servants and cooks and cleaners and maids and all that kind of thing. And they lived in a position, and this was true of many, many working people in Britain at the time, and indeed around the world, in a position of ignorance. I don't mean that in an insulting way, but many of them didn't have access to, certainly didn't have access to the sort of communication that we have or anything like that. And I started my book on women in the chapter on women in the First World War with a quote from a woman who was a maid on a farm in Yorkshire in 1914. And she says, although 16 years of age at the time, England had been at war 3 months before I knew. I was in domestic service on a farm near the River Humber, and one day as I was attending to ducklings, a shell whizzed over my head from the direction of the river. This was in November 1914, and I refused to believe a farm boy who told me that England was at war. Girls who worked as maids on those small farms were completely isolated. The farmers and their wives never talked with the girls, except to tell them what to do next. They had no books and never saw a newspaper. They were on duty from 5 in the morning until 10 at night, and were not allowed to 25,000 women. And these were people working in very, very dangerous conditions. They were working with shells, making ammunition, lots of explosions, lots of people killed. As a result of this, many of them got industrial diseases as a result of the ingredients of the weapons that they had to have. And of course, what this did was to change the way that they approached things. Firstly, they went to these jobs, they didn't have somebody telling them, they didn't have the farmer or the farmer's wife telling them what to do. They lived in lodgings or they lived with other of their workmates. They earned incredibly more than they earned in domestic service. They earned 2 or 3 times as much. Therefore, they had money. When they finished working, they would do what most men had traditionally done and go to the pub, and that was regarded as terribly shocking and daring, and of course, consequence maybe of going to the pub, they also had sex with people and met people and sometimes had children outside of marriage, and this was regarded as even more shocking. So you had the beginning of breaking down these sort of, which were still sort of hangovers of Victorian conventions, which many, many women had. And of course they began to think of themselves in a new way. So a woman called Vera Brittain, I don't know if anybody has ever read her books, Testament of Youth and Testament of Experience, who was a nurse in the First World War in France, and who's the daughter of, is the mother of Shirley Williams, who's the, she's a politician who's now herself very old, but she was the daughter of Vera Brittain. And Vera Brittain explains just how you go from, and she was quite an upper class woman, you go from this very sheltered background to suddenly you're dealing with daily carnage, trying to look after people as a result of the war. And this begins to change your attitudes, and of course it did with a whole range of people. Unfortunately not with the people who ran this country, because at the end of the war they did grant women the vote, but only if they were over 30 and had a certain property qualification, on the grounds that no doubt they were meant to be more sort of respectable and, know what to do with their vote, unlike dangerous 21-year-olds who weren't given it on the same basis as men for another 10 years. But they wouldn't let women stay in these jobs. They wouldn't let them stay in the engineering jobs, in the jobs in factories. In fact, they tried to get them to go back into domestic service, but women rejected this almost exclusively. They tried very, very hard to get them back and couldn't do it. So you had a situation where women's lives had changed and they changed, but they were expected to fit into the pre-war patterns of work and family and everything. There was, of course, another huge problem after the First World War, which was that there were what they called 1 million, what they called surplus women. In other words, such had been the casualties among men, nearly 1 million men died in Britain alone as a result of the First World War, but there were loads of women who weren't going to get married, weren't going to be able to settle into domestic bliss even if they wanted to. And therefore, they had no choice but to go to work, or they had no choice but to have some sort of career or live on their own or any of the other things that they did. So actually you found, even though they stopped women working in these jobs, women went into other forms of work, into white-collar work, into clerical work, shop work, and into light industry, making aircraft and things like that. Now then, when you had the Second World War, you had an even more dramatic change in women's lives, because when you look at the 20th century, you're talking about total war in the sense that, actually, even in the First World War, 15% of all casualties in the First World War are civilians. Today, it's the other way round. You know, only 15% of, probably less than that now, actually, of casualties in wars are military. They're nearly all civilian. And if you look at wars today, they're conducted against civilians. The Second World War was a real turning point over this. It was a war against civilians. You look at it, there were terrible casualties in some battles and in some military engagements, but essentially the people who died in very large numbers, not just people who were affected by bombing, obviously all sorts of other things happened, including the Holocaust and the terrible destruction of life, particularly in Russia and Poland and so on. But the civilians were the people who were waged war on, and of course London and Britain famously was bombed, very, very badly bombed, for a year, or nearly a year, quite seriously. You know, the Blitz was actually 1940 to 1941. Then that stopped, and then you had, towards the end of the war, the rockets, you know, the V1s and the V2s, which were an absolutely terrifying experience, and very many people died as a result of them. Now, that was a very dangerous situation, obviously. It was a situation of great upheaval. When war happened in 1939, there was virtually no shelter provision, or not adequate shelters. People were expected to go and sit in ditches in the parks. You know, you'd be going over to Russell Square and there'd be a ditch that was 6 inches deep, which was supposed to protect you from bombing, which of course it didn't. So there were big campaigns at the beginning of the Second World War about getting shelters, which the Communist Party led. The reason that people were able to eventually go to the underground and sleep in the underground as shelters, which they did for much of the war, was not because the government wanted them to, but because people forced their way into them, and then the government had to agree to this. And for women, the changes in the Second World War were very dramatic. They were discouraged from looking after their children. They were encouraged to send their children away to be evacuated, but that they should work in factories and offices. So therefore, the whole idea that you're the mother who looks after your children all the time went. They were conscripted into work. They had to work either in the armed forces. If you were between 18 and 59, you had to work either in the armed forces or you had to work in what was called a reserved occupation, which was something to do with war, essential war work. And you couldn't just leave your job, you had to get permission to leave your job and all this kind of thing. So you have this kind of conscription, you have women being encouraged to leave their children. In Birmingham they even had hotels for children of war workers, what were called hotels. They probably weren't as great as all, they probably weren't 5-star of the sort we might think about today, but they were, you know, places where children could lodge while their mothers were working shifts, building aircraft or doing any of these things. There were nurseries, for the first time, widely provided anywhere. There were what were called British restaurants, which people said were very, very good restaurants, actually, where people could go and eat, have their food cooked, which was very unusual in Britain at the time. People didn't go out, working class people didn't go out and eat, apart from in cafes at lunchtime. They didn't go out in the evenings, and they didn't go out to eat very much at all. So all those things were provided. In some factories, they even provided women who would be shoppers for the other women who were working in the factory, because you had to queue up to get food, so you had to wait hours to get your rations and things like that. So all of that broke down many of the aspects of the family and changed many of the aspects of the family. And of course it also had a profound effect on sex and attitudes towards liberation. I interviewed 2 women about the Second World War. One was this amazing woman called Angela Sinclair, who was a pacifist at the beginning of the war, and decided to go and work in what was called the Friends Ambulance Unit in the East End of London, which, as you can imagine, was very, very dangerous work. And she talked all the time about how it's very interesting, all of them, they didn't really talk about how dangerous it was. She says, I remember one quite exciting incident. There were several nights, and there was this one where there was bombs everywhere, and you didn't need light because you could see the light from all the flames going on. And that she saw all this white stuff on the ground, and the brewery had been bombed, and the beer was all swilling all around the street. And she talks about how people didn't have the resources. She talks about how in the East End there was a segregation between the Irish people and the Jewish people, who had separate shelters and lived and worked very, very separately. She talked about all those different sorts of things. And Angela was, you know, a very, very remarkable woman who ended up doing all sorts of amazing things. She ended up working in a refugee camp in Egypt and later in the war, and so she was quite incredible. You could write a book about her on her own. But then there was the other woman that I interviewed, was a woman called Billy Figg, who was a friend of my mother, actually, during the war. And she tells the story. I mean, I actually put it as a sort of subheading in the book, because she says about how exciting it was. She says even her future mother-in-law, who was in her 40s, it hadn't worked for 20 years, 25 years, went and got a job in an arms factory in Walthamstow, and her and her husband used to go to the pub, the first time they'd ever done this, and this was common. There were big debates about whether women should go to the pub on their own. I mean, it seems incredible now. Big debates about whether women should wear trousers. In fact, my own mother, who came from a very, very isolated village in Cambridgeshire in the Isle of Ely, and who absolutely detested it and was an orphan by the time, and sort of ran away to London, rather unfortunately, in 1939. But she went back to visit one of her uncles, and wearing trousers and red nail varnish, and he threw her out of the house because he thought she'd gone to the devil and something absolutely dreadful would happen to her. So there are all these things going on, and you can imagine the sort of traditional values that, you know, people like her uncle had were absolutely terrifying. And actually, Billy actually, I quote, and I put it in a little subhead, she said the whole idea of virginity got lost in the war, that people just stopped worrying about that they shouldn't have sex before marriage. Because obviously, if you're going to be in a situation where you're going out with somebody who's going off to fly a bomber over Berlin or whatever it is, then actually you're not going to think, well, maybe I'll wait 5 years and save up for my wedding, which is what people used to do beforehand. And so, of course, as well, many young women were no longer living at home. You know, they were in the armed forces, or they were working somewhere away from home and relodging, so they had more opportunity to do this kind of thing. And again, huge changes. The Second World War, the end of the Second World War, there was record numbers of divorces, because a lot of these people did also get married. I mean, one of my aunts got married in what used to be famously described as wartime marriages, you know, which had looked on slightly risque, and lots of them didn't last because, for obvious reasons. And she got divorced in, I don't know, 1947 or something. And there was a big glut of divorces because so many people had had these marriages and they didn't last and they didn't want them to last. A big increase in children outside of, I've only got 5 minutes.
They have longer.
I've only got to the second, I'll try to speed up. Big increase in children born outside marriage. Big increase in sexually transmitted diseases. Big increase in LGBT type of activity and relationships and so on. All those sorts of things change in the war. Now again, at the end of the war, there is an attempt to stop all these things going forward. There's all sorts of cultural things which encourage women to go back into the home. And many women, we should understand, wanted to go back into the home because you've had 6 years of war and disruption. You know, the idea of a house and a garden probably isn't the worst, and a couple of children probably isn't the worst idea in the world. Women were not allowed to stay in the jobs. Again, they'd done all these jobs in the Second World War. They were shipbuilders and aircraft builders and all these sorts of things. And they weren't allowed to stay in these jobs by and large. The men got them back. They weren't given equal pay, which was equal pay, very interestingly, starts as a demand in 1918 with the bus workers in London who demand the same pay. It goes through to the Second World War, where there was such a demand for equal pay that even the government holds a royal commission on it, but decides it's not practical, they can't afford it, and women don't really want it, you know, the usual story. So it's another 25 years before there's an Equal Pay Act introduced in this country. So they try and push all this back in the box, but of course they can't succeed because all these ideas and all the changes and all the different things that have gone on have had a big impact on people. So what you get from the Second World War, big increase in women going into higher education from a very, very low base, and still very low compared to what it is now. Women going out to work, and for the first time married women going out to work in big numbers as well as single women. So all those things begin to happen. And I would argue that although it takes another 25 years. And I don't really have time to talk much about CND and the Vietnam War and all those sorts of things, but just to say that they were remarkable for women who were involved in those campaigns, very, very noticeable. And they were the first generation of women who began to benefit from the impact of the social changes as a result of the wars. The 1944 Education Act, the liberalising of attitudes to the family, the fact that women were having smaller numbers of children, which was the case from after the First World War actually, but all these things began to change. And of course people began to think, well, maybe we don't need, maybe you can have an abortion and it won't be the most terrible, because of course abortions, which were illegal until 1967 in this country, again dramatically shot up during the war. And in fact, any woman of that generation will tell you they were extremely common and very, very widespread and very dangerous often. So the women who organised around CND and who formed what's called now the second wave of feminism, the women's liberation movement of the 1960s, were women who were the children of these women who'd been in the war, or some of them had experienced it directly. So this had a very big effect on people. And then of course you move on to more modern, and then of course you have, I can't really not say something about Greenham, because Greenham I think was the fusion of some of those ideas of women's liberation and the coming together of the changes in women's lives. And therefore you have this women's movement, a mass women's movement against missiles, cruise missiles being sighted at Greenham Common. Very, very big, very supportive. Lots of the women that I talk to in this book, I interviewed a whole number of women. Many of them talk about Greenham as a turning point in their lives or something very fundamental. One of the women I introduced, Helen John, who's a well-known peace campaigner who actually goes and she's now outside RAF Waddington in Lincolnshire campaigning against drones. She had 4 children and a husband in Wales, and she just left them and went to Greenham Common. And that was her life. It changed her life completely. And she was, by that time, I don't know, she must have been 35, 40 by that time. And, people did that kind of thing. And I think the big miners' women's sport network, which arose in 1984, I think was very much influenced by Greenham, very much political continuity. And then, just to bring it up to date, of course, it's the last 11 years with the Stop the War movement. And that's something which I think, 2 things. I think it's firstly there are a huge number of women involved in the movement at every level. We've always noticed it, it's always been very remarkable. It's always been the case that there are women at every level of campaigning, organising, speaking, writing, much more so than I can think of any other comparable campaign. I'm not trying to diminish any other campaigns. I mean, many of them have women involved in them, but I think it's quite a remarkable thing. Partly it reflects the thing I said earlier, that women are by and large more anti-war than men, if you want to look overall. But I don't think that really explains how those people have got involved and got active. And I think it was a combination of coming in the middle of a whole number of anti-globalisation movements, mainly the one at Seattle in 1999, which also then spread to various huge demonstrations and campaigns around the world. I think it was partly a result of that, partly that you had the impact of these generations of women who changed as a result of war, and partly, I have to say, the question of Muslim women was absolutely central to this, and I still always find it amazing at how many Muslim women are involved in this. I interviewed a couple of them, one of whom was a school student in 2003 and organised school student strikes. She was 17 or 18. And she's now just had a baby and she's training to be a barrister, and, so she's, late 20s now. But she talks about, it was her university with Stop the War, that's when she learned that it was possible to organise and to do things. And she was absolutely amazing, because the day after 9/11 happened, she went, you know, she was a Muslim, she was absolutely terrified of going into school and explaining what had happened, and she had to explain that Muslims were peace-loving, and she felt terribly defensive about it all. And this was, I think, what a lot of people felt. And then she found that actually she developed her own confidence and strength as a result of deciding to organise and to campaign, and that's what she did. There's another woman called Rania Khan, who's a councillor in Tower Hamlets, who's, again, she must be, I don't know, she's probably about 20 when the war broke out. And she, again, talks about how this makes a huge amount of difference to her. Henna says, the anti-war movement was, Henna was the first one, the anti-war movement was my university education in war and peace. I was empowered by the anti-war movement as much as I was by attempting to fight for the liberation and free the people of Iraq. They were in turn freeing me from the shackles of mental slavery. And Rania said, I began to realise, as a result of the anti-war movement, that whichever way you look at it, it's the poor, the working class who suffer the most on the back of multinational companies who make billions during the war, and it's truly shameful. I was also inspired by the young people of St Paul's Way School in Tower Hamlets who attended the protests demanding why our government had gone to war in Iraq when that money could be better spent fixing their broken schools, better spent on their housing needs. The anti-war movement gave women like me a platform and a voice to speak against injustice. Solidarity and empathy of supporters of the Stop War movement with those suffering was humbling. So those are the kind of things, and I think that whole thing was very, very important in developing an anti-war movement, in changing attitudes towards it. So I'll end it there, and then obviously people can that's my kind of my thoughts about the book and the general sort of introduction to it. And obviously there's a lot left to talk about, and a lot left in the future about how we respond to present and future wars. So.
Okay, thank you, Lindsey.
We're opposed to it. The problem is that probably lots of women did vote for her in 1979 because she was a woman, and she very much played up this image of, she knew the price of everything, and she had a handbag, and she went around, to the supermarket and all that sort of stuff. Which of course she was married to a royal millionaire, so probably very unlikely. But that was the way it was portrayed. But I think the essential thing that allowed Thatcher was not that lots of women necessarily supported it, but that she succeeded in destroying big parts of the working class movement and the trade union movement, which then actually allowed, what we've seen in the last 20 years, this gradual erosion of strong union organisation, the erosion of people's conditions at work, the worsening of people's conditions at work, to the point where now, after 13 years of New Labour, we now have this coalition government which has really got the gloves off and is really trying to take everybody on, and people are only just beginning to kind of get off the couch and realise what's going on and fight back. That's really what's happening. So I think that's the bigger part of it. And I think now, I don't know, when Thatcher dies, there will be, lots of people saying how wonderful she was, but there'll be millions of people in this country who will celebrate, quite unlike Chavez, actually. I notice, despite all the talk over here about how controversial he is. I mean, in my view, she's a much more controversial figure in this country. Anyway, so yeah, that's what I think. On sexism and women's images, I think it's very weird because this is it's not a new phenomenon, sexist images of women, but the scale of it now is completely different from in the 60s and 70s, let alone 100 years ago. It's just everywhere. And I find lots of things very, very distasteful, not just the images. I mean, you have people who are on the left who use sexist language and who use the C word, which I really feel, as a sort of derogatory, it's almost like a sort of nothing, that people say all this sort of thing. And I find it very disturbing, really. I mean, and I know some people don't, and I mean, you can't, but I mean, I do think we have to begin to get some sort of control of this. We have to start saying that, it's not acceptable to have these. you know, whether it's a man or a woman designs a phallic symbol of a woman, then what does it matter? We don't want to see it. It will be my image and my attitude. And we did have these things in the 70s and 80s. People used to campaign to get Playboy and things like that removed from student union shops. And I think, it all sounds very quaint and old-fashioned now when you think what goes on. But I think to say that we don't want this on official student union material, we don't want it on official university material, we don't, there's certain things you can't control, unfortunately, like the sound. But you can control things that we're actually directly involved. We don't want the shop to stop whatever thing that we find is unacceptable. We don't want, all the ridiculously sexist things they have, the parties and all this kind of thing. And to be honest, the guy at UCL, I think really the returning officer should have ruled it out of order. How can you identify as a woman when you're a man? How can you say you want to be the woman's officer when you're a man? It's just disrespectful to everybody. And of course, particularly, it's disrespectful to LGBT people. It's disrespectful to women. But when it's saying is, oh, well, of course, none of this is serious at all. Whereas people have great challenges dealing with questions of sexuality and stuff. And it's just, that's what I think. And if that fails, maybe, pick it or something of him. Might be, I don't know. But might be a good idea. And I think you're right, we've got to get some politics back into this, because it's all become sort of relative, it's all relative. What are you making such a fuss about? It's all irony. Don't you understand none of this is serious, Which is only a variation on the old 60s stuff, when they used to say if you were, that you were frigid or you didn't have a boyfriend or something, if you complained about sexism. It's the same kind of stuff, really, but just sort of updated for the 21st century. And it's just, reprehensible, really. So, no, I think we should campaign around some of these things, really.
Okay, this is so interesting. Have we got any more questions? It's a few minutes past 8. Yes, sure.
Yeah, I just had a comment to make. It seems that what I said was actually completely misunderstood by everyone except the person who answered the question.
Well, that's good.
Thank you. Thank you. Because when I said something about women wanting to participate in the army, I wasn't advocating it. I was just saying that it was a question of representation. When you have someone saying something in the majority, and you have a minority opinion, if it becomes about, oh, we're in the majority and we're right, therefore we will not hear the voice of the minority. It's not about majority versus minority. It's about hearing everyone's voices and then convincing them that they're wrong, if they are wrong. But then to not hear a person's voice because it goes against what you're advocating, you just completely create a completely different, exclusive world where you are not listening to anyone. At some point, not wanting the war was in the minority. You have to fight to make it the majority. You are right, but that doesn't mean you don't hear someone else's voice. It's just a question of being able to hear what everyone's saying. And then, of course, debating over it and reaching compromises, new ideas, innovations, creativity. I was just clarifying what I said.
But the thing is that people hear Hillary Clinton loud and clear. They,
We're not about Hillary Clinton. We're talking about a girl in SOAS who may also want to feel that she wants to be in the army eventually. Men are sexually assaulted in the army as well. It's not about whether Hillary Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, whatever. It's about if someone says, sitting in this room, if someone says, I want to be in the army, are you going to actually scream that person down, or are you going to listen to them and talk to them rationally?
But you'd have to have an argument. Well, I think what I'd say is you have to have an argument with someone.
Not an argument, you can just have a
No,
discussion.
argument as in an argument.
Yeah, okay.
But,
Well, thank you very much for that.
okay, well, thanks.
If you'd like to buy a copy of the book, I'm sure Lindsey will sign it to you.
Yeah.
There are lots of amazing events coming up, and you can see the literature on the table. One specific event I'd like to mention is a film screening called The Lottery of Bats. This is an award-winning documentary about individualism in the era of liberal capitalism. And it's on the 15th of March, which is a Friday. 15th of March is the next Friday? That's next Friday, isn't it? At 5 p.m. in the Khalili Lecture Theatre. So it's a brilliant film. Please come and watch that with us, and that's about it.